Greetings, fellow truth seekers. Join us at Paranormal M as we uncover the secrets of the supernatural. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to embark on a journey through the unknown with our captivating stories. Winding Stream Trail, Part 1. The Lady in Black. When I was 23, my first husband and I purchased our very first home together. The year was 2013. We were newly married, decided it was time for a home of our own. By the time we had settled on this one particular house that we'd been seeing on the market for a few months, most places that we had looked were either kind of too far from work or family. So this house was centered close by everybody, and the commute to work was short enough. So it was perfect. It was definitely a fixer-upper. It was built in the 60s. So, because of its age and the amount of work it needed done to it, we got it for a really cheap price, around $60,000, if I remember correctly. It was a 2-story house with 2 bedrooms and bathrooms with a full basement, 2-car garage, and a beautiful sunroom. In the backyard was an underground pool with water so green it looked black. The whole yard was fenced in and extremely overgrown. The house sat on a very wooded and secluded plot of land. So wooded that even from the street you'd have a hard time spotting the house unless you were really looking for it. The first 6 months went off without a hitch. I acclimated to the house and my new surroundings pretty well. I can't remember exactly what started it, but after a while when I was home alone, things started happening. Small things. I would get this strange and overwhelming feeling of being watched by someone or something. I would hear strange noises around the house as if someone were walking around when I was the only one home. At first, I just chose to ignore it. If you've read any of my past posts, you will see this is one of my coping mechanisms. I ignore it, and it'll go away. Maybe. Though most of the time, unfortunately for me, that isn't the case. It was close to Christmas, and I remember my husband at the time, I'm going to call him B. We were out visiting with his family, who had come into town for the holidays. That particular year, we had a terrible rainstorm. So bad it was like a monsoon. Because the weather was so bad, we decided to stay overnight with his family members at his aunt's house. Make the journey back home the following day. When we arrived home the following day, we were grateful that we didn't have any downed trees or damage to the house. Huge pine trees spanned the entire yard, front and back. Or so we thought. Our washing machine and dryer were located in the basement. I've never been a fan of basements, ever since I was a little girl. So I usually had to haul the clothes hamper from our room upstairs down into the basement to do laundry. When I got down into our basement, it had completely flooded out from the rainstorm the night prior. Everything that was down there was completely destroyed. We instantly felt the pains of being first-time homebuyers. In the following days, we contracted the home insurance company to make a claim. After work one afternoon, B asked me to take photos of all the damage in the basement to send off to the insurance company. I was home alone and loathed going into that basement, especially when I was home alone, but I knew it needed to be done, so I grabbed my digital camera, put my big girl pants on, and made my descent down into the basement. When I reached the door, I expected to be met by water, but since a few days had passed, most of the water had been absorbed by the walls, and the excess had leaked out through the garage door and into the yard. There wasn't much light down there due to the basement not being wired correctly, and the drop ceiling made it impossible to install any lights. So I opened up the door that led into the garage, used the only source of light from the basement bathroom, and began snapping pictures of the basement. At first, everything was fine, but then I snapped a picture and what I saw absolutely baffled me entirely. In this particular photo, there appeared to be what looked like long white ghost hooks falling from the ceiling, the kind of hooks they use in slaughterhouses to hang meat onto. I snapped a few more pictures to see if it would show up, but they didn't. But I was able to catch a few more light anomalies, like orbs flying around in the photos, but nothing like the hooks from the first photo I took. Wish I still had these photos to show as proof, but unfortunately, so much time has passed that they've been kind of lost over the years. After a few more minutes of snapping photos, that same overwhelming feeling I mentioned before came rushing in on me. Except this time it wasn't just a feeling. Standing there alone in the basement in this big house with no one else around, I heard the distinct sound of a voice standing right next to me. I couldn't make out what it said or if it was male or female, but I knew I heard it. My eyes widened with fear as I scanned the basement. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks as my heart started to pound out of my chest. Something was down in that basement with me, and I was wanting no part of it. I instantly ran through the door that led to the 2-car garage and called B, frantically trying to tell him what had just happened and what I had just captured on camera. Naturally, he played it down, shrugged it off. To him, it was all in my head and nothing more. Admittedly, I was frustrated and annoyed and felt dismissed entirely. Fast forward about a week or two. By this time, I had all but forgotten about the basement incident. Life was back to normal and continued as usual, and I was getting ready for bed on this particular night. I was usually in bed way before B. I'd be laying in bed watching TV as I fell asleep with the volume turned down really low, because I'm a light sleeper. The only real noise in the bedroom was from a fan blowing on me to keep me cool. If you've ever been to Georgia, then you know how hot it can get in the summer months. Eventually I fell asleep, but my peaceful slumber wouldn't last. I woke up to that old familiar feeling of being paralyzed and unable to move or speak. Except this time I was seeing everything around me. My eyes scanned the room, and at first I didn't see anything until my eyes shot to the foot of the bed where my feet were. Sitting there at the foot of my bed was a woman. I was instantly scared and didn't know what to do, so I just kept staring at her. She had long black hair that spanned down the length of her back. She was wearing what looked like a solid black kimono or a dark monk robe. I couldn't see her face at first because of the way she was seated and positioned. Then after a moment or two, she began to move. She turned her head to look at me, and when she did, I noticed that she had white bandages wrapped around where her eyes should be. The wraps appeared to be covered in a dark substance, almost like dried blood. She began crawling toward me, grudge style, and when she began doing this, for some reason, my reaction was to look away. She didn't like this at all, and it did nothing to deter her. Not even a moment later, I was face to face with this thing. When she reached my face, I could feel her hair on my skin, and her mouth opened. It was circular and black, and when I say she started trying to suck my soul out like a Dementor from Harry Potter, I literally mean I could feel this as it was happening. At first, I was just letting it happen. It felt weirdly peaceful. I remember thinking to myself briefly if this is what dying feels like. Then it's actually pretty peaceful. A few more seconds pass, and it's like I snap out of whatever daze I'm in, and I realize I need to fight back or I may die. When I say I was instantly filled with rage and void of fear, I mean it was like a switch kind of just flipped. I was no longer scared of this thing, and in fact I was extremely pissed off. Literally heard myself cursing this thing out and telling it to get off me. I was all fight and no flight. A few moments later, I was able to get myself out of it. My brain and body were once again on the same track. I sat up out of bed, my heart racing, and B was sound asleep next to me. My eyes darted and scanned the room to make sure nothing was there, and that it was safe. And of course, I didn't see anything there, and this would be my second run-in with sleep paralysis, and my first experience with the lady in black. Winding Stream Trail, Part 2, Down the Rabbit Hole. Towards the end of this 2-week period, I had another episode of sleep paralysis. So much for feng shui. This was the first time I'd experienced episodes so closely together. There was at least a year or two that separated my first 2 episodes. This one happened as I was falling asleep and not waking up. I remember on this particular night I was having a really hard time getting comfortable and falling asleep. I'm not certain how long I was tossing and turning, but it must have been for at least a few hours. I just remember at one point being aware that I felt like I was floating down. What I can only describe as being like a stream of soft silk. It flowed like water in a stream, but it was so soft that it didn't have like a cool or warm sensation to it. I distinctly remember thinking to myself, this feels really nice. I'm just going to relax and see where this goes, because I had been struggling to fall asleep for so long. I was extremely naive to think that, well, after what I'd just been through previously, this relaxing and somewhat soothing experience quickly turned into something much more disturbing. As I began to indulge in the silky river and allow myself to drift off, I was met with the most evil and sinister sounding laugh you could possibly imagine coming from outside around me. Not in my head, but right next to me at my bedside in my bedroom. Though my body was paralyzed, there wasn't a sensation of heaviness on my body like there had been before in previous episodes. And even though it was a struggle, I was able to fight my eyes open, at least enough to see around me. That usual intense fight-or-flight emotional response was more than apparent, and once again, I was all fight. It felt like whatever this thing was intentionally trying to scare me, like it was getting some kind of sick, twisted enjoyment out of tormenting me. I mustered all the strength I could in my neck to turn my head to the side of the bed where this laughter was coming from. The challenge of struggling to open my eyes was just as difficult, but I was eventually able to get my sight positioned exactly where I would have been standing. But there was nothing there. I could see really nothing at all, and I'm not quite sure if most people would have the same response to these things as I do, but I instantly got pissed off. I began to order my brain to snap out of it, and every muscle in my body to start moving. I wasn't able to try to force myself to go to sleep after this. After some time writhing, I was able to finally force myself up and awake. I sat up straight in bed, right away looking around the room, my eyes darting to every nook, cranny, and crevice. The room was dimly lit by a silent TV screen, the only noise coming from the ceiling fan above. My husband at the time was once again asleep soundly next to me, none the wiser to anything that had just happened. I didn't understand what was going on, and I had no one to talk to about it. The few people I did decide to share it with usually didn't even know how to respond. Things only continued to ramp up after this. My energy levels started to greatly decrease. I was sleeping 12 to 16 hours a day, and sometimes more. No matter how much or how little I slept, I would feel completely exhausted. Forcing myself up and scraping myself out of bed to even go to work was misery. At this particular point in time, I was going through a lot in my private life, and I was extremely unhappy in a lot of areas. Depression from private life combined with confusion and frustration about all things going on with me, and the things going around me, the things that didn't make sense, depleted my energy basically, entirely. Can't recall how much time exactly had passed in between, but eventually I began to get woken up while sleeping very regularly. Be woken up to my name being called. Sometimes it would sound male, other times kind of female. There were times it sounded demonic or even robotic, but the voice never sounded the same each time it would happen. In the coming weeks, that turned into months, spending a lot of time alone by myself. I'd spend a lot of time just sitting at my PC in the computer room, usually playing video games and listening to music. On this particular day, I was sitting at my computer desk playing World of Warcraft with a friend of mine who lived in Texas. We're going to call him C. We were on voice chat through Discord, and we had just entered into a battleground, PvP arena. All of a sudden, my entire computer just shuts off completely, and so does the light in the room. I look over at my husband at the time's computer desk, and it was close by to mine, as his computer was still on and running like normal. At first, I thought it was a simple power surge or a blip since the house was quite old. But then I started to feel that weird type of energy start to build up in the room around me. That same kind of energy I felt all those years ago when I was 14 in Panama City Beach, Florida. The room started to feel really heavy, like there were too many people crowded into one room, even though I was home completely alone. I don't know why, but I began to feel extremely unsafe, and I told myself to just leave. I low-key started to panic, decided to call my friend back on the mobile. I explained to him what was happening and asked him to stay on the phone with me while I got dressed to leave the house. My bedroom was located right next door to the computer room. As I walk out of the computer room and into my bedroom, it was like whatever it was, I could feel it following me. I grabbed a t-shirt and a pair of jeans from my closet. I tell C to hold on for a few seconds while I get dressed. Set the phone on the bed, rushed as fast as I could to get dressed. As I'm almost finished and pulling my t-shirt over my head, I'm instantly frozen in fear. I hear someone standing next to me whispering something incomprehensible into my ear. It was so low I couldn't even make out if it was supposed to be male or female. Paused for just a few seconds, still hiding within the safety of my cotton-threaded t-shirt, to see if it said something else, and it did. I pull my shirt over my head and look next to me, revealing nothing being there. Grab my phone and my purse, and I tell C I'm calling my grandfather to come pick me up. Unfortunately, my car had recently broken down, so I was unable to drive. My grandfather only lived about 10 minutes drive away from me, so thankfully it wouldn't take long to get there. I sat on the steps of my front porch until my grandfather arrived. Even though it was about a 10-minute journey, his arrival seemed to take ages. As soon as his car came to a stop in the driveway, I jumped into the passenger side seat, and I must have appeared to be a bit visibly shaken, because the first thing he asked me was if I was all right. I honestly didn't know what to say or how to begin to explain what was going on with me without sounding completely batshit crazy. For years, I'd been experiencing odd things here and there since being a little girl, but nothing ever like this. Other than my sister and a few friends here and there over the years, I never spoke to anyone about these types of things. Most of the time, it was because I didn't know how to, and honestly, I didn't want others to start judging me or thinking that I'm crazy, because it's the easiest thing to do in these kinds of circumstances. To just assume someone's crazy or mentally ill over these sorts of topics. Especially when you come from and live in the Bible Belt. When we arrived at my grandparents' house, my grandfather and I sat in his porch smoking a cigarette. We sat in silence for a few minutes. I was inwardly trying to decide if I was going to try to open up to him about some of the things going on with me or not. I thought to myself the worst that could come of it was that he would think I was a complete Fruit Loop who just my cheese maybe slid all the way off its cracker, or mine. Instead of laying it all out, I just asked him a few questions on the subject. I asked him if he ever experienced something he couldn't explain, something that seemed odd and maybe even supernatural. My grandfather was a man's man, very old school. Well, if something upset him emotionally, he wouldn't know it. He never cried in front of anyone except maybe my grandmother, and he wasn't easy to have emotional or even spiritual conversations with. I asked him if he had ever felt things or saw things that he couldn't explain. He looked out into his front yard and took a long drag off his cigarette. Surprisingly, he nods his head and says, "Yep." I'm not sure if the shock was apparent on my face, but so many questions came flooding into my head. I was extremely curious. He continued on to say that there had been few times in his life that he had seen or felt something strange, but would deal with it by ignoring it. Fortunately, my curiosity was short-lived and I decided to just leave it there. I was at a crossroads, and I knew I had two options. I could either choose to embrace what was going on with me and open myself up to it, or possibly find some answers, or I could choose to keep trying to ignore it. Well, since trying to ignore it for so many years didn't seem to be working, I took it upon myself to open myself up to the possibility of something that seemed impossible. It was time to travel willingly down that rabbit hole. Secret basement. In September, my partner and I signed the lease on a dream apartment. I was ridiculously excited and just kept telling everybody I knew about it, to the point where I was probably actually pretty annoying. One day, a friend of mine came to visit me at work, and of course, I told her the news of our new place. She asked me where it was, and when I told her the location, she turned pale and seemed uncomfortable at best, and flat out scared at worst. She asked to see a picture of the inside. When I showed her, she let out a long sigh of relief, then proceeded to tell me one of the creepiest stories I had ever heard. It turns out about 5 years ago, she had lived in the house directly next to mine with her sister and boyfriend. Starting almost immediately when they moved in, they began hearing noises out in the kitchen area at night when they were sleeping, and would occasionally wake up to open cabinets or kitchen tools scattered around. Eventually, they started hearing what sounded like kids talking in low voices in the kitchen at night, occasionally crying, and crashes that sounded far off but still somewhere in the house. Around this time, my friend and her sister started to fight a lot, said that they had both been feeling extremely irritable about everything. Their house was broken into while they were all at work one night, but nothing was stolen except some cheap costume jewelry. There was cash, valuable jewelry, and designer clothes in the house, but it was all left untouched. Later in the same month, they received a visit from the cops. They said a neighbor had called about screaming and crying coming from the house, had reported that they left their kids there alone when they were out. They didn't have kids. The cops were called a few other times and finally got a search warrant. Somehow ended up finding a trap door under the kitchen window area that was covered in a layer of leaves and dirt. They found out that it was the remains of a very, very old root cellar. I live in one of the oldest cities in America by European colonizer standards, and most of the structures are built on top of older structures. Apparently, one thing led to another in the search down there. The police recovered some very, very old skeletal remains of 2 children. Nobody seemed to know if the skeletons or the root cellar were there first. During all of this, my friend and her sister broke their lease and moved out of there as soon as possible. They were terrified to be there any longer. I went through with my lease and live in the building next door where all this happened. My apartment is an old adobe market. It was converted into an apartment in the 70s. It's been an absolute dream to live here. No scary vibes or noises at all. The couple who live in that house now seem pretty nice and keep to themselves. We all have high adobe privacy walls and coyote fences. I feel tempted to see if they know anything about any of this, but I'm afraid it might make them uncomfortable if I approach them about it. Mysterious figure sighted screaming at 4 a.m. Police called. 2 witnesses. Yesterday at 4 a.m.-ish, I was awoken to someone down my road screaming, "Aw!" and then talking. This happened 2 to 3 times before I panicked and looked out my window. Saw this guy walking in the road screaming, "Aw!" Then talking and screaming again. I lost sight of him, ran to my mother. When we both got back to my room 20 or 30 seconds later, we could still hear the same screaming. I would have written this off as a crackhead just being a crackhead, but the odd part of the story is that the screams were distant. It's hard to explain the structure of my neighborhood in text, but opposite my drive, there's an entrance leading to a park. You walk forward, then go to the left, forward again, and there's a large metal gate. It's always locked, and that leads into tennis courts and a small field. This is 120 meters away from the road that I saw him. When I got back to my room with my mother, the screams were distant, and the same sound, but they were distant too, not in the direction he was walking. My mother's hearing is not that great, but she heard it twice before it stopped. It sounded like he was far away and had to get to where it sounded like he was at. He would have had to run and climb a broken, locked, and rattly gate. We heard nothing for 2 minutes, so Mother called the police and gave a description of what I saw. Stayed up for the next hour looking out, trying to hear anything, unsure if the police did anything. My mother asked around with my neighbors, and no one heard anything at all. Ring the doorbell, didn't pick up anything. Distance too far away from the door. I check out the route that he would have had to take to get the gate locked, and nothing out of the ordinary. I'm just really dumbfounded at how the screams got so far in a span of 20 seconds. Lived beside a Canadian heritage dollhouse built in 1898. A bit of background, so I'm a 28-year-old male who lives in BC, Canada. This experience had happened when I was about 9 years old. During the time, we used to live by a heritage site which was called the Pillath House. You can Google it, Pillath. My family and pretty much the whole neighborhood used to refer to this house as the creepy doll house. Every time we drove by or spoke of it, this experience happened on like a windy but somewhat rainy fall day. I was sick that day, so my mom made me stay home and not show up to school. At the time, it was only me and my mom at home. I had 2 older sisters that were in high school, and my dad was at work. My mom used to sew clothes for a living, and worked from home a couple of days during the week. Right outside the rear sliding door, the exits to the backyard, we built a small shed like a room area where my mom could sew and store sewing machines, supplies, and etc. She would be there a couple of hours a day, and we would kind of just wind up checking on me, at least when it was time for lunch. On this particular day, it was a normal sick day for me, just like every other sick day. I woke up, had some cereal, and turned on the TV and watched some Barney while my mom was in the backyard sewing her clothes. The couch I was on was facing the TV, so my head was turned to the left, and in front of me was a black glass fireplace with a reflection where my feet were facing. We also had a sort of a hallway that would lead up into the bedrooms where my head was pointing at. As I was watching Barney, and I remember this pretty vividly, I noticed a dark figure with its knees bent, hunched over and swaying side to side with its arms bent out in the reflection of my fireplace. This figure was dancing, quote-unquote, for a couple of seconds. That was until I turned around to look down the hallway and nothing was there. It was almost as if it was mimicking what Barney was doing on TV. I wasn't frightened because I thought it could have been one of my siblings home from lunch just screwing with me. I called out my siblings' names, but no one answered. I even ran down the hallway and checked out all the rooms, but again, no one was there. Ran out to get my mom and told her what happened, so we both came inside to look around, but the house was empty. But here's the strangest part. Sometimes I'll leave this part out because it just makes it even more unbelievable. But here we go. As we were coming out of the hallway, the front door slammed open, so I had to go downstairs and close and lock it. It was windy that day, but the door should have been locked. We didn't think much of it and sort of just brushed it off. Fast forward more than 10 years later, by this time we'd already moved out. My My sister came to visit me, and my parents were just sort of talking over lunch. My sister had recently learned that her friend's dad works for the government and was assigned to take care and maintain the Pillith house. She only brought this up because the Pillith house, again, used to be right beside us. This would require him to stay at night so he could wake up and do yard work. Apparently, he's had some frequent experiences in that house, such as random footsteps, knocking, but mostly somebody jumping on his bed while he was trying to sleep. He was never bothered by it because it was so frequent. He mentioned that there is a spirit of a little boy and a man in the house. She was telling us this, and I immediately connected the dots. I'm pretty sure I met that little boy, and it seemed like he just wanted to play. I remember at the time when it happened, I wasn't at all scared, but now I think about it, it is a bit creepy. Part 2. Generations of Hauntings. Afternoon, y'all. I started with the part 1, The Doppelganger Underneath My Bed, so if you haven't already, go ahead and give that a read. This story is filled with accounts from multiple family members. It's a long one, but I hope you enjoy. Cheers. My father's side of my family lived in Des Moines. That was in the late 60s to mid-80s. Through divorce and a house, burned to ashes. My grandmother and non-blood grandfather moved into a house suitable to fit the 10 members of their family. Their children consisted of 4 girls and 4 boys. Almost all the experiences were witnessed by the women of my family, which is very important to note. Everything started with an act of kindness. My aunt, we'll call her Jay, they're the 3rd oldest out of the siblings. After moving into the house, Aunt Jay did some exploring, as one would with new territory. She found an old cemetery with her younger sister Kay, being the kind-hearted people they are. They spent a day clearing the overgrown grass and dirt-covered gravestones. The longer she stayed, she felt connected to the people, so she was just taking time to read the names on the stones, hoping to keep their memory alive. Unfortunately, she made a terrible mistake. Shortly after the clearing of the cemetery, subtle but strange things began happening in their home. It started with the smell of roses, almost as if someone had brought fresh flowers from the market. The smell would be brief. It would kind of come at random moments, like walking through the hall or while they sat and ate dinner. They couldn't explain it, but it was pleasant. They never minded. Soon a noticeable stain appeared above the kitchen doorway. My grandmother, being a housewife, spent more than enough time trying to rid the stain, but no matter the cleaning method, it would never fade. The stain turned out to have much more significance than just a visual inconvenience. Around this time, 2 neighboring boys were walking to school. They came across a grisly sight. A young woman was found in a grassy roadside ditch, dead, covered in morning frost. The area had been seeing a lot of kidnappings and murders of young women at the time. This will be a key element later on in the story. As time passed, the occurrences became more frequent, more intense. The house was 2 stories. Most of the bedrooms were in the basement, which was slightly unfinished, leaving few lights and some doors without doorknobs. As you could imagine, if left, sort of an eerie feeling in the house, already fueled with energy. At the time, the 2 oldest siblings, both boys, had moved out of the house, leaving 6 siblings behind. One of the first visual sightings belonged to my father. He witnessed a green mist flow through the empty hole where the doorknob would be. He would hear knocking at his door and shuffling of objects in his room. My dad was young at the time, so of course he moved into a room with his brother, who was basically deaf and never personally experienced anything. I'm not sure if any more personal experiences he had, because he would not really share them with me and really acknowledge what he experienced anyway. This explains why he wouldn't listen to me about the creature under my bed. Next was my Aunt S. She might have had the most terrifying experience in the home. S was my grandfather's child. She was adopted during his first marriage as her mother had passed away from cancer. She had already experienced so much in her young life, which led to her being pretty susceptible to the events. On one night, she woke up to the shaking of her bed, and what happened next would shake anyone to their core. She saw faces. Hundreds of ghoulish green and yellow faces covered her walls and ceiling. They were looking straight at her, mouths moving as they were speaking. They didn't make a sound, and after that night, she understandably moved into her sister Kay's room on the upper floor. Aunt L, who was also pretty young at the time, one notable occurrence she experienced was she could never hang anything up in her room. Everything would fall or fly off the wall. One night her mirror flew off the wall, shattering into a million pieces. Objects on dressers would fly across the room. She never got a restful night's sleep. In 2018, I discovered that Aunt L could hear voices of those past. No matter where she goes, she always has experiences to this day. Now, back to the key member of this story, Aunt J. One night, all the siblings camped on the top of the easily accessible carport. As the kids were sleeping, their dog started to bark. Jay woke up and investigated the backyard. They had a shed not too far from the carport. A light pole sat right next to it. At the base of the pole, she saw a glowing sliver of bluish light about 3 feet long standing vertically. The light slowly moved up the length of the light pole to the top of the tree line where it stayed for at least 5 minutes. She told me she felt pretty comfortable, almost as if it were a longtime friend. After some time, the light bent 90 degrees and quickly took off, fading into the night. Fast forward to her senior year of high school. As the school year was ending, she came down with a serious sickness that took her out of school for more than 2 weeks. One day she needed to go to school later in the morning, which caused her to have to walk almost a mile distance to her school. The neighborhood was familiar to her, knowing almost every family in the area, so she walked comfortably to school. About halfway, an older and loud muscle car passed her slowly. It would turn around and make a couple of slow passes. As he passed her the last time, she heard a crystal-clear voice of a woman in her ear say, "Run!" And so she ran. Jay could hear the car door open and footsteps trailing behind her. The school was surrounded by a green belt, so taking the road to the school would be a death sentence. But taking the shortcut through the green belt could save her life. As she ran through the dirt trail, she heard the voice again telling her to relax your arms. So she did, and the man ripped her backpack off her shoulders. She ran as her life depended on it. As she made it to the edge of the school parking lot, she jumped over like a log into the parking lot, just escaping his grip on her jacket. She ran into the school immediately, reporting it to the principal. They never found the man. Jay believes, along with the rest of my family, that it was the man who murdered the young girl that was found in the ditch. Jay also believes that the sliver of light was the girl's spirit that truthfully saved her life. When enough became enough, my family spoke to priests at the University of Washington, leading to an exorcism and blessing of the home. A medium came to the home and told them that a man and his wife lived on the property in a house that no longer stood. From an unfortunate event, the wife died, and the husband died shortly after. The gravestones my aunt had, they were those of the husband and wife. Turns out that the smell of roses was the wife. The priest spread holy water over the house, even on the stain over the kitchen doorway, which eventually disappeared. After that day, the energy seemed to die off. things began to feel as a house should. Their story ended up in the newspaper, all identities hidden, but their accounts had been recorded for the public to read and believe for themselves. Most of the family moved to Idaho, which led a new family to move into the home. They discovered later that the daughter had an imaginary female friend, but she wasn't imaginary at all. There's no updates on that family or their experiences. With my 8 aunts and uncles, I have 9 cousins, and 7 of them are male and other 2 are women. Remember how I said the experiences were mostly felt and witnessed by women? Well, my 2 cousins and I have had numerous experiences throughout our lives. My cousin T had an imaginary soldier friend. He would talk to her and tell her things a young girl would have no understanding about. My cousin K recently had a heartbreaking experience that revolved around a murder of a young girl in the Seattle area. She would see her everywhere she went, the grocery store, walks, and within the hallways of the hospital she worked at. Turns out, the young girl had been murdered by a family member, and her murder hadn't been caught until recently. And as for me, my experiences started when I was 7 with the terrifying experience of the doppelganger under my bed. In my early preteen years, I lived with my mom and brother in a newly built house. But at this time, I'd gotten an iPhone 4 to be exact. My friend had stayed the night. She was one to be obsessed with her looks, so she decided to take selfies on my phone. Upon looking at them, we discovered a face. It was hovering over the fabric of the couch. When she had took a picture, it was dark and the TV was playing in the background, but it was bright and no light would reflect off the fabric of the couch. After finding one face, we discovered 3 more. The faces were absolutely evil looking. They were cloudy but translucent, yellow eyes and mouths. They were open, exposing large teeth. My mother made me delete the photos, but I regret deleting such powerful evidence of the paranormal. Years passed without another profound experience, but I always felt the energy of certain places, always feeling uneasy and sad when I shouldn't. Fast forward to 2018. I went on a much-needed family vacation to Seaside, Oregon. I was accompanied by 2 friends who wanted to explore the area. Close to Seaside is Astoria, which sits at the mouth of the Columbia River. The area is notorious for the dangerous ocean waters that have caused hundreds of shipwrecks in the early years of its settlement. We wound up touring a historic Victorian manor originally built by Captain Flavel. Although rich in history, the energy was non-existent. We moved deeper into the town to get our fill of the history. We were directed to an old firehouse turned museum. There we met an older gentleman by the name of Dr. D. He was a local college professor but did tours of the firehouse in the summer. Through curiosity and respect to the building, we quickly became trusted companions. He led us to the 2nd floor to a door that led to a stairway to the 3rd story, which was the firemen's quarters. He explained that if the door was locked, we weren't invited, but if it was unlocked, we were welcomed in. The door was unlocked, so we made our way up the stairs, the railings and windows filled with dusty cobwebs, a path that didn't seem well traveled. Once we reached the top of the stairs, I began to feel like we were invading on someone's space that we didn't belong in. We turned around and headed back down the stairs to the 2nd floor where there was 2 rooms of exhibits. While crossing through a doorway into the other room, my friend quickly turned around explaining that the lights had just flickered on and off numerous times. Once I stepped into the room, I was immediately stuck to one spot. I stood in front of the glass case ceiling and an old uniform. I couldn't move from that spot. I was overcome by sadness and despair, feeling that energy being drained out of me. As we stood there standing in front of the case, the light began flickering, Dr. D explained that those lights are all connected to one switch, so there's no reason for one case to flicker. Eventually, we were able to step outside. I sat on the curb regaining my energy, but still stuck with a pit in my heart. To this day, I can still very clearly recall that feeling. 2018 was the year I moved from Idaho to Seattle. This is when the stories were passed down to me, and I eventually got the chance to see Des Moines' house. It still stands looking friendly on the outside, but the terrors of my family still resonate within its walls. From my experiences, I always wondered why I saw and felt things that others didn't. I soon discovered that the women in my family are sensitive to the spirit world, which only leads to more questions. I don't know what lies ahead of me, but I'm sure my experiences don't end there.
You are listening to the content of ParanormalM.com.
Had conversations with brother for 2 days before I found out he died the week before. In parentheses, cross-posted. So when I was 13, my older brother 18 and I were on our way to a movie. That's when we were hit by a drunk driver. I woke up in the hospital 4 days later, having lost my right leg and the other leg in a cast along with other injuries. That night I woke up to my brother sitting by my bed telling me everything will be okay and to go back to sleep. Next day, parents came to visit, see how I was doing. I asked why my brother wasn't with them. They looked at each other, but they didn't say anything. That night I again woke up to brother sitting by my bed again, telling me he knows I can get through this and that I need to be strong and overcome this, and not to let my injuries stop me from living life. We talked a bit, him not answering specific questions, but answering more general questions. I remember asking him why he was still wearing clothes from yesterday, because that was very unlike him to wear anything similar to what he wore the day before. He didn't answer, but when asked how he was, he said better than he thought he would be given the circumstances. He reminded me to be strong and keep living and not let anything stop me, no matter how, and basically remind me that he loved me before telling me I should get some more sleep. That next day, parents again came to visit me in the hospital, and I again asked why brother wasn't with them. And they again looked at each other, and it was only after I said that I would like family visit together, not at different times, and would like brother to visit during the day when we can talk more instead of at night, that my dad asked what I meant. And I told him Andy had been coming at night to visit. My mom broke down and left the room. My dad then told me that it was impossible because Andy died in an accident instantly. I didn't believe it. I argued it. I ended up having to be sedated. That night I had no visit, and the next day, parents brought newspaper articles about the accident. Years later, my fiancée had an experience, and having never seen a photo of my brother, she described him to me to a T and what he was wearing. That's a story for another time. But it was nice knowing brother's still around looking out for me and those I love. Brother visited my fiancée. Continuation of story from yesterday. Something to note before getting into what happened. My brother died when I was 13. We were both in a car accident. My fiancée never met my brother, never seen photos of him before this. My fiancée is bipolar, extreme highs and extreme lows. We had been dating for 4 months at the time and just moved in together. I didn't know at the time, but she had gone off her meds. This all happened while I was at work, and she told me about it later. She went out for a walk to get some air. She was feeling really claustrophobic. The start of a manic depressive episode. Got to the point that she thought dying would be the best option, and standing on a corner, she thought the best idea would be to just walk into traffic. As she took a step off the curb, someone grabbed her and pulled her back, turned her around into a hug, arms wrapped around her, telling her that she that she doesn't truly want to do this, and that everything will be okay, and that she's stronger than she realizes and it isn't her time. Told her to just breathe nice, slow, deep breaths, and she looked up at him and said thanks, turned around, wiped her eyes, and when she turned back, the person was gone. She told me about this when I got off work, and she wanted to put up a post online to see if she could find the guy to say a proper thank you for his help for saving her. It was when she started saying what he told her and describing him that my heart started beating fast. I knew who helped her. She described him as being 17 to 18, athletic, slightly taller than her, dark brown shaggy hair, big freckled birthmark under his right eye, and a blue shirt that said JS, Jenks, in yellow letters. It brought B back. It brought B back to... Okay. I think it says, it brought me back to the visits I got in the hospital. The shirt my brother wore on the day of the accident, and when I saw him by my hospital bed. I told her I know who helped her, and I can't explain it. Told her it was my brother, and that she said that was impossible. It was a real person. She got mad for just suggesting it, because she never believed in ghosts or spirits or anything like that. Very skeptic. I asked her to please trust me, and that night we drove to my parents' house. I went into the basement and found a picture of my brother and asked if it was this person who helped her. Her face went pale and kept asking how it was possible. I had no idea what to say because I didn't know either, but told her how he came to me in the time of need, and it looks like he came for her and hers. Was it a death wish, or just bad luck? A bit of background before we get into the story. For as long as I can remember, I've experienced strange things. Usually it's just hearing voices calling me or seeing various entities, etc. But this particular story is more of a series of events that led to a conclusion. As a kid, there was one instant where I was walking home from the neighborhood pool with my brother and a couple cousins. I reached the crossing a minute or two before them and decided not to wait for them. I looked both ways multiple times, not seeing any cars. I started crossing the road to the next crossing. My brother started yelling at me to stop. I turned to look back at him and asked why I didn't stop at the intersection. When I told him that I did and looked several times before walking, he told me that there was no way that I could have stopped because they weren't that far behind me and I didn't stop. They would have seen me. It wasn't safe to cross. I argued back that it was safe to cross, and I started crossing, and he looked me dead in the eyes and said, "If that car hadn't stopped, you'd be dead." And that's when it dawned on me to look around again. There was a black sedan with tinted windows sitting just inches away from me. I hadn't seen it or heard it drive up. So between the ages of 8 and 17, I almost drowned several times. The last time was probably the scariest. I was at a youth camp with a friend's youth group, and we had gone for a swim in the lake during free time. So a group of us decided to swim out to the boat to go jet skiing. It wasn't very far swim, maybe a couple 100 feet or so, and I wanted to ride a jet ski in an environment where it wasn't storming. Halfway there, for whatever reason, I decided to turn back. I swam back, and once I reached a spot where I know I could stand, I stopped. But as my right foot touched the bottom of the lake, a hand grabbed my right ankle and pulled me under. It was gripping me so tightly I could feel the claws digging into my skin. I struggled and called for help until I heard a voice say, "Stop struggling, no one's coming." And I felt myself go limp and be pulled further under the water. Right as I was beginning to lose consciousness, I was pulled out by a girl I had just met. She helped me back to the dock where I coughed up a lot of water and cried for a bit. It'll be 5 years this summer, and to this day I can still feel the hand gripping onto my ankle with the force to crush it. After I got my license, I spent a lot of time with friends when I could. The first time anything weird happened was while I was driving. I was out with a friend and we'd run a few errands for her mom before going to pick up her cousin. We stopped at an intersection and the light had just turned red. As we sat there, I watched the light change from red to green, and so I accelerated thinking that it was a standard green light. But it almost felt heavy, if that makes sense. I described it as feeling kind of like I was in a trance. My friend started yelling, "What are you doing? Stop!" I snapped out of whatever state I was in and realized that we were seconds away from being T-boned, possibly killed by this massive white van. Moved back into my new original spot, and I just kept trying to tell my friend that the light had been green. She didn't believe me. After that, I started getting into accidents. Mostly just minor things like accidental bumper taps. The second of the three I was in, which was the most major, I was driving to a job interview. My vision went white. It was almost like somebody put a white cloth over my head, and by the time I could see again, I was plowing into the back of another SUV. About 6 months to a year after that, my parents took me to see a therapist because they were worried that I might have been suicidal. The therapist asked general questions about my behavior leading up to not only seeing her, but also to some of the events. I was honest with her. When she asked me if I'd ever heard of a death wish, I admitted that I hadn't. She told me that she figured I had one. Still not sure what to think. Haven't had any more accidents, but it can be argued that I've simply just found a car more suited to me instead of a death wish. However, I haven't been able to find a lot about it, but if you guys have any ideas on what could have been happening, let me know. Can a shadow person try to strangle you? So yesterday I found this subreddit. Spent the day reading it, and at a certain point I feel like I needed to stop reading it, because I was having some kind of feeling that it might attract the attention of a nasty critter. But I didn't really have anything to base this on, so I stopped for a while, then started up again. I've been reading a lot of posts about shadow people, and in the comments, there's a lot about sleep paralysis, which I had previously never experienced, at least not in a terrifying way that everybody describes, but it is a symptom of restless leg syndrome, which I do have, but I'm also medicated for it. Brutal. So when I go to bed, I was kind of wishing that I hadn't read so many spooky stories before bed. In the middle of the night, I feel like I've woken up and above me on the bed is a humanoid figure made of shadows. I have the impression that its hands are around my throat, although I'm not experiencing any trouble breathing. I can't move. I remembered from all the posts that I had read yesterday that I'm supposed to be stronger than anything that comes at a person while they're in sleep paralysis. So I fight the paralysis. And I have a bite guard in my mouth because I clench my teeth at night and I start trying to force the words "go away" out of my mouth and move my arm and wake my fiance. I didn't write that. And eventually I'm able to force the words out after a lot of shitty mumble attempts. Get my arm to touch my guy. Okay. And after I say "go away," it does, and the sun comes up, and my guy wakes up in my dream and is like admiring the way the sunlight hits my face, and I sleep with blackout curtains, so this part's definitely fiction. Then I actually wake up. The weird thing is that I didn't have a lot of feelings of serious lingering fear. I mostly feel loved, but I'm still half asleep. But like a half asleep, safe, go away. I say this out loud for real this time, and then I roll over to snuggle with my guy even though it was too warm and I fell back asleep. Now, until yesterday, I didn't know anything about shadow people specifically. But when I was a sophomore in high school, I would go on walks with my dog at the local park at night. Night's a stretch. I live in Minnesota, so it was like going at 6, but it was dark. I always had the impression of shadows being where they didn't belong and watching me, and with a sensation of movement at the corners of my eyes, and, well, When I'd get home, I'd find new bruises on my arms and legs. At the time, I had just read the book Tithe, T-I-T-H-E, and at the time I convinced myself that it was get creatures. Get creatures, apparently. So I stopped going out at night, but I had a lot of trouble sleeping at night because I just felt like I was being watched. It was that feeling you had when you were a child, when you're too scared to open your eyes for fear of what was in your room at night, but as a high schooler. Everyone told me I was imagining it, and I was like, I know, but it means my mind is a horrible place to be. Years later, I was diagnosed as bipolar. I just chalked it up to that, but it should be noted that I'm type 2 bipolar, and since then I'd had no hallucinations. I would just get really depressed, or when I was manic, I would just be really artistically productive, and a little slutty and bubblier, and I'd spend all of my money on stupid shit. Anyway, I just wanted to get some feedback on whether it was just an odd dream, especially because it seems like shadow people are mostly just kind of watchers from the posts I read yesterday. Me and my best friend saw something unexplainable. I don't have a lot of memories from my past. I've undergone a lot of trauma in my childhood that I blocked out. Yet, this one memory is something so vivid and clear I can detail what we saw that night. It all happened in my backyard. My parents had a big bonfire for the neighborhood back then, almost once a week. But they soon got a tiny fire pit closer to the house, just for our personal family time. My best friend was always invited, since she was always around. I was around 17, I was around 7th, going into 8th grade that summer. We had just gotten a smaller pit. My mom, dad, sister, nephew, and best friend were roasting marshmallows, just enjoying the night, talking and laughing and just having fun. All of a sudden, a very white figure appeared in the corner of my eye. On instinct, my head turned to look at whatever it was, and it was so out of place in the dark night. My heart raced like it never had before. My eyes went really wide, breathing, picking up as I saw this white saber-toothed tiger. It had the black stripes accompanying its white fur, and it saw me, and I saw it. And when I blinked, it calmly walked behind my neighbor's dog fence and disappeared. I went to turn away as I'm used to seeing these things, but usually alone. I was afraid my whole life until that point I was crazy. That I was just seeing things. But when my head turned so I could go back to my family, my eyes met my best friend's. Her eyes were way more frightened than mine. She whispered to me, "Did you see that?" To which I honestly was stunned and replied, "Yeah." She was terrified more than I. And that's when my mom asked what we were talking about. So, before I could answer, she responded with exactly my own description. I knew I wasn't just seeing things, as she had been the one that actually said she saw what I saw. My mom told us we were seeing things. No one else saw the white mass. We did. They just saw darkness. We still talk about whatever it was, and she's still terrified to talk about it. I witnessed a car accident that apparently never happened. Back in 2013, I was moving from Florida to Kentucky for a new job with a close friend I grew up with. It's about a 15-hour drive, so we decided to leave around 6 p.m. and drive straight through. That was to get to Kentucky the next morning. The route takes you through Atlanta and then a long, dark stretch of mountains in Tennessee, where there's no exits, call service, and it's very steep. There's about an hour-long drive where there are signs everywhere that say "No Jake Brake" and "No Braking Downhill." When you're in the mountains while driving, it feels very dangerous going downhill. This was in November and the roads were very slick at night. It was about 3 a.m. I was driving. My friend was in the passenger seat sleeping. We were coming down one of the mountains, and up ahead I see a bright light that's slowly getting bigger as I approach. I realize what I'm seeing is a car fully engulfed in flames in the left lane, bottom of the hill. I yelled to my friend to wake up so we can figure out what the hell to do. Obviously, if anyone's in the car, they couldn't have survived, and we weren't equipped to help. It also seemed like a dangerous idea to stop the car because the bottom of the mountain, and, well, worried that we'd be in danger from oncoming cars so late at night. I mean, the car was on fire, and I barely saw it until I was so close to it. As we're trying to figure out what to do, we realize neither of us had cell service, but we see a sign for a gas station 2 miles up the road. We get to the gas station and tell the guy working up there what happened. He tells us, unfortunately, that this is something that happens from time to time. He would call a state trooper for us, but he could tell him exactly what happened and give any information that we could. Less than 10 minutes later, the trooper pulls up. We tell him exactly what happened, but he's confused. He says to get to the gas station to meet us, he was driving the same direction we were driving. There were no other exits for 15 miles, and it would have been impossible for him to miss a flaming car. After a few minutes of us basically arguing with him about what we saw and assuring that we weren't on any drugs or hadn't been drinking, we travel south with him, following us to the location of the accident. And sure enough, there is no burning car there. No car at all. To this day, me and my friend are sure of what we saw. We passed within maybe 10 feet from the car itself, 1 lane over. We saw clearly a car burning, but apparently it never happened. "3 months ago, I seen a black figure at work. Ever since then, things have changed. It's been a while since I posted. With the whole COVID-19 and life getting super insane working at a hospital, I haven't had much time to really get on Reddit or any social media. There's something I wanted to discuss, share, and even get some input on. What I'm about to type out is going to sound so beyond unreal and fake that it's going to drive many off or cause many to say it's not true. 3 months ago, I seen a black figure kind of hiding around the corner. As I ran after it, it seemed to get further and further away. After going to security and seeing nothing was there, I figured maybe it was something in my head. About a month later, I see this figure and I start getting weird gut feelings. It's almost hard to describe, but it's kind of like a sick-to-your-stomach feeling at the worst, and others feel like something's off, like the feeling you forgot your phone when you're leaving home and don't realize it yet. What I realized over time was that when I got these feelings, me, friends, family, and most recently, even I, was in danger. I was in a dark spot. The first account of many I had with a friend was he was in a dark spot. Got that uneasy feeling in my gut, had the urge to message him and ask him if he was okay. That was when he told me he was going through some dark stuff and wasn't sure who to talk to or where to go. He said if not for me messaging him, he might have done something bad. The most recent one that happened was to me. A few days before I went out to my friend's place, a whole 3-hour drive away, my stomach was in the worst twist possible. Throughout that Monday night, I kept seeing the black figure around my area. It was always watching me from afar. Everything went fine going up, usual traffic being hectic in big cities with all the riots. Everything went fine. No riots that night, no fights, but the next day it started raining hard. Long story short, I hydroplaned off the freeway. Luckily everything was fine, and I walked off with a messed up shoulder and headaches. Radio-like noises in the night. My name is Marco. I live in the south of Italy in Sicily. I've been a paranormal enthusiast from when I was 6 years old. Although I had some strange experiences in the past, I always tried to think rationally, and I always tried to give a possible explanation to those happenings. And I can confirm you that I keep this approach still to this day. But recently, some particular occurrings left me scratching my head. Not quite terrified, but just confused. 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was in my house. I had just finished studying for my graduation exam. That would have taken place the day after. I decided to just relax a little bit, just sit in front of my porch enjoying the nighttime fresh air. As you can imagine, in that moment, I was basically riding a roller coaster of emotions. I was pulling out of the pockets of my headphones when suddenly a noise caught my attention. It was a radio-like noise, the noise that you might hear when your radio is trying to connect to a station that's far, just hard to connect with. I had no idea from where that sound could have been produced. It appeared to be not that far from me, and I live in a countryside neighborhood in which nobody would ever think to use radio in that hour of the night. It was strange, but in the end I had other weird things to think about. I blamed that on suggestion. Some days earlier, I read about Siren Head and the other creations of Trevor Henderson. So it had just been a suggestion, right? Well, a week ago, another one of these happenings made me doubt that. I was again sitting in the porch, but not the same. I actually had 2 porches, and while the first faces the gateway of the house, the other one faces my garden and some trees that I have. Again, I was enjoying the freshness of the Sicilian night, but this time I was also with my girlfriend. Like the other day, I was in a kind of a great state of emotion. I won't say why, but you can imagine. And while we were there, it happened again. I heard that same sound, but much, much closer, almost coming from a tree that was like 5 meters far from us. I also can almost certainly tell you that this other occurrence happened almost at the same time as the first one before. But one other detail stood out the most for me. This time, mixed with the radio buzzing, it seemed like there was some disembodied voice that spoke God knows what. The voice also seemed to be from a radio. Curiously, my girlfriend told me that she heard something, but it was very different from what I heard. Some sort of mix between a growl and the sound of bushes when the wind blows. I'm not claiming that we're talking about a Siren Head sighting. It would be silly since the creature is just the creation of an illustrator, but then, why I heard that noise, and why I heard it in 2 precise moments in which I felt strong emotions. This is weird, but I'm not actually scared. I just wanted to share with you my experience, hoping to find somebody with some experience like the one that I had, or just somebody who can give me an explanation.